A reading from the book of Ruth. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered the field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in the field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of the harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread, and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to the men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished. and she lived with her mother-in-law. The word of the Lord.
The Gospel according to Luke. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those for whom you expect payment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies. Do good to them and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because He is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
You may be seated. You know, when we're reading Ruth, I find it a little bit more difficult to draw messages out of this type of story. Give me a good David and Goliath story. Give me a good didactic speech from Jesus that points something out. You know, I can run with that. But this is one of those everyday stories. This is one of those stories that evolve slowly over time. And it makes it a little bit more difficult to find the message in it. And I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it's just because things that evolve slowly, things that are part of day-to-day life, feel less important, less interesting, kind of mundane. Now I realize that Ruth, the story we're reading in the book of Ruth, is not our everyday story, thanks be to God. But it was Naomi's. Naomi started off, think about this, probably as teenagers. She and this handsome young man got together and they got married. And they were going to start a family. But there was a famine in the land and they didn't know how they could support their family, so they had to move to some place where they could find a means of supporting a family. Nobody in Binghamton has ever heard this story before, right? So they moved to a whole nother country. And things must have gone fairly well for them. They lived there for quite a while, raised up 2 sons, married those sons off to some nice neighborhood girls. Looked pretty good. Until life changed for Naomi. Life changed big time. And we all have been in those positions where life just suddenly changes. We don't know what happened to her 2 sons and her husband. We don't know what killed them, or even if they died together, or if it was separate occasions. We don't know any of that. I mean, they could have all been on the same plane that went down. They could have been all in a car accident. They could have all caught Ebola. And I don't say that to be funny. I say that to show you that these are things that still happen in everyday life. So she lost her husband, and she lost her 2 sons. Needless to say, she was devastated. But not only that, for her, in Naomi's time, that was not a good place to be. A woman that did not have a male relative to watch over her, to speak up for her, was in a real precarious place. Because remember, women were property then. They didn't count for anything. So what was she going to do? She did the smartest thing she could. She went home. Not so much to go live with somebody or to go get their support, but so that she'd be in the neighborhood where maybe some mercy would come her way from family members. She was devastated. She complains against God. In chapter 1 we read where she says, just call me bitter because my life has turned bitter. God has turned against me. But she continues on with life. Somehow she manages to keep going. I mean, for her, what else is there to do? That is what you do. You find a way to get out of bed in the morning. The beauty of the story is that while Naomi is living out this everyday, tedious despair that has infested her life, God is still working a story of love around her. Still revolving around her is all of God's grace and love and plans for the future. She can't see it, but that doesn't stop the story from happening. It still happens around her. God changes or puts in Ruth's heart to stay with Naomi. And it's a good thing. There's no way Naomi could have gone out and worked in the fields. She was older. And if she could work in the fields, it wouldn't have been for as much as Ruth did. And so Ruth basically brought home the bacon for them, or the barley and the wheat. She helped sustain her mother-in-law. And isn't that how God begins to help us, to work with us, to love on us, is through one another? That's exactly what God does. He puts it in someone's heart to embrace us in some way that we need. And so God's story continues, and we can see it in Ruth. While Naomi is living out her everyday life, while she is trying to figure out a reason to get up in the morning, God is working out a plan around her that's not just about her, not just about Ruth, but it's a plan that is about the entire universe and all of eternity. Because for God, what he sees is that there's going to be a great-great-grandson who's going to be the best king Israel ever had, King David. In Matthew, you remember the first chapter of Matthew where we used to read it in the King James Version? It was always so-and-so begets so-and-so who begets so-and-so. You remember those? This is verse 5. And Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab, and Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth, and Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. So out of this lineage, we got out of the lineage of King David, out of the lineage of Ruth, out of the despair of Naomi's real, everyday life is birthed who? Jesus Christ our Lord. That's the story that God sees, that Naomi can't see. There's no way she can see that. She can only see what's right in front of her face. And most of us, that's the way it is. We can only see what's right there in front of us. We can only feel and touch what's right there. And that becomes what's real to us. But God sees the whole story playing out around us, all the way around us. You know, if a pebble had consciousness and could tell what was happening to it, when it went plop into the water and started to fall, it would say, okay, I'm getting wet, maybe a little cold. I'm falling and falling. It's getting a little darker, a little colder. And eventually it might say, oh, I'm nestled down in the mud of the bottom of the pond. Or I'm sitting on top of this other really hard rock that I just ran into. That's what the pebble would understand. It would not see that on top of the water, its tiny little plop has grown and grown and grown in concentric circles, going further and further out to reach the shores of the pond. It can't see that. And yet that is exactly what has happened. Every day can feel monotonous. Sometimes it feels like drudgery, doesn't it? There are just days like that. There are days that feel joyful and exciting. But we got to remember that our stories do not begin and end with us. Do you understand that? Do you understand? Russ's story did not begin the day he was born. It did not begin the day he was conceived, or night, as the case may be. It began years before that. And guess what? On the day that Russ leaves us and goes to heaven, his story won't end. It continues on and on in concentric circles, reaching out further and further and further. Think about it, those who built this church. If they had looked and said, we can't afford that. That's going to take out of my pocket. I might not be able to get the latest and greatest wagon wheel now because I have to donate to the church. Think of all the time and energy I'm going to have to put in to help build it. If they had seen just that part of it, we wouldn't be sitting here. But instead, they saw that there would be generations to come, that things would happen in the future, that this church could make a difference in years, in 100 years from the day that they started. They might be able to know, or maybe even sense, that this would become the little church that stood on the corner of Chapin and Main Street and made a difference in many, many, many lives. Mary Lou, I'll bet you she doesn't do Sunflower Park because she wants to plant sunflowers. She could do that in her own yard. She knows there's a bigger story. Judy can cook at home. She doesn't have to go down to the friend's dinner to cook. But she does, because she knows there's a bigger story. And Ruthie didn't take over RRF because she was bored. I can almost guarantee that. She knows there's a bigger story. I don't know if this came out of the whole news with Robin Williams or not. But what I want you to hear is you are important. What you are experiencing today, what you are going through, the pain in your life, the joy in your life, whatever it may be, is important. And God is working miraculous stories around your everyday life. You may not be able to see them. Matter of fact, none of us can usually see past what's in front of us today. But God can see there. He can see past. He has seen what your story will develop. He has seen what led up to your story and where your story will go for all eternity to the next generations. And according to Genesis, it says God saw that it was good. Let's just take a moment with the Holy Spirit. Brothers and sisters, somehow we always think that suicide is for the teenagers. But I don't care what age you're at. If you ever reach that point, if you have a friend that reaches that point, a child, please remember, life is precious, and God is building a story around that life. Come talk to somebody, because there are a lot of people, a lot of Ruth-type people that would like to walk alongside you.